next sitting day, and we call now on Government Order of the Day number 3.
Interrupted debate on the second reading of the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Bill.
Members, when the bill was last debating the second reading of the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Bill, Maggie Barry had the call. She has 6.5 minutes, which she appears not to want to pick up. The next call would be a green call by rotation. Eugenie Sage.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Peace and goodwill must be breaking out in the House given the number of bills that the Green Party is supporting today. We are very pleased to support the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Bill because we certainly agree with the value of modernising our historic places legislation, changing the governance structure of the Historic Places Trust to one which better reflects its Crown entity status, simplifying the Archaeological Authority consent process and ensuring that we have an effective system for identifying our historic heritage. And we also welcome the improved planning functions which Heritage New Zealand will be required to undertake, and that includes doing things like developing a general policy statement as to how they're going to administer the New Zealand Heritage List and the Landmark List. Mr Speaker, the Select Committee made quite a few improvements to the bill and certainly acknowledge and thank the many submitters who raised issues which led to these changes and the work and advice of officials. Some of those notable changes were to remove the arbitrary limit of 50 on the number of places which could be on the National Historic Landmarks list, and other countries such as Australia and the United Kingdom which have such lists don't have a numeric limit. And to just get on the list, you need to have, or the place needs to have, outstanding national heritage value, and it needs to be subject to appropriate legal protection. So that's already quite a high threshold. While the Green Party is supporting the bill, we do have some concerns about it. The first of those is the much greater emphasis on protecting landowner rights as part of what the National Government calls a rebalancing between heritage values and private ownership interests. And seeing this provision in other legislation, such as the proposed changes to the RMA, potentially will give greater weight to landowner interests and less weight to community interests. Our second concern is around ensuring that the new heritage advocacy committees at the regional level are well supported, and the third is around the emergency provisions for dealing with heritage post-disaster. Looking at each of those, in terms of the rebalancing, in Clause 11, that sets out the functions for Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga, and it requires the Trust, when it's performing its functions, to, and I quote, recognise the interests of an owner in a particular historic place, historic area, wahitapu or wahitapu area, end quote. This wasn't in the bill as introduced, and there is no equivalent section in the functions, equivalent provision in the functions section of the Historic Places Act 1993, which this bill will replace. And the requirement to recognise the interests of an owner is a much stronger legal test than to have regard to or to take into account. And our concern is that this may lead Heritage New Zealand equivocating and not using its powers as a heritage protection authority under the RMA, for example, where you've got a conflict between an owner's desire to modify or harm a heritage building and the need to protect and preserve it. And submitters such as Historic Places Canterbury said that by international standards, New Zealand's got very weak protection for heritage buildings. And in this bill, the Heritage List, previously the Heritage Register, doesn't have any statutory weight unless the buildings and places in it are listed in a city or district plan. And yet there's no provision in the bill to require councils to ensure that those buildings are listed. And we've seen in Christchurch what happens when you have an emphasis on landowner rights at the expense of the community values of heritage. Post-earthquakes, we've had more than 220 listed heritage buildings which have been demolished, and 40% of those listed buildings are in the central city. So the very oppressive SERA legislation and its noxious Section 38 consent process overrides the normal RMA processes for demolition, and where you've had landowner rights and interests in wanting to demolish a heritage building and take the insurance payout rather than repairing and restoring that building when there's engineering advice saying that can be done, then the buildings end up being demolished and their value in creating an interesting and character-filled city is not recognised. So we think that the bill gives too much weight to landowner interests. Our second concern is the way in which the transition from the voluntary branch committees and structure of the Historic Places Trust to new organisations, and whether these new organisations are being adequately resourced. Because before the Act was reviewed, we had 24 functioning branch committees, and submitters told us that they received $170,000 annually for their projects and administration. And that was about 5% of the Historic Places Trust's annual income from membership subscriptions. Now, these new regional voluntary organisations will take on some of the roles of the former branch committees, but they won't get any ongoing funding from Heritage New Zealand in the way that the branch committees did from the Historic Places Trust. Certainly, the Ministry of Culture and Heritage is providing a one-off allocation, but we would encourage the Minister to be more generous with this establishment funding so that these new regional organisations are well positioned to do the heritage advocacy work of the former branch committees. And then finally, our concerns about the emergency provisions, which are in clause 58. There's a fast-track procedure here to get an emergency authority to enable the modification or destruction of an archaeological site where there is a state of national or local emergency being declared, and for about 12 months after that. So this is about streamlining the process, but this whole streamlined process has been a disaster for heritage buildings in Christchurch, and there's been a failure to recognise the need for people with heritage protection expertise to work alongside the emergency services people and the people who are active immediately after the quakes. And we had Christchurch heritage expert and architectural historian Dr Ian Lockhead talking to a petition to the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee recently. His concern was that there's no robust and readily accessible data on the status of heritage buildings and heritage sites and the level of seismic code compliance that would be readily available to civil defence in emergency situations. That could help prevent the quite large-scale heritage destruction that occurred in Christchurch as a result of ignorant gung-ho actions. What would also assist is if there was a national register of people with heritage knowledge who can be called in to work alongside the first response personnel. Because we had about $30,000 of needless damage done to the government buildings in Christchurch when people just charged through doors which the building manager had unlocked, and that could be avoided if we had a bit more care around the emergency provisions. But Mr Speaker, the Green Party will be supporting this bill because it does include a lot of useful provisions to actually modernise the way in which our heritage is managed.
The question is, is a member seeking a call? Jacinda Ardern.
Why?